Welcome back to AIM Agenda. Yesterday in Parliament we saw the Coalition ramping up pressure on the government over the asylum seeker issue. The Prime Minister acknowledged the government may need to move asylum seekers to Darwin, to the mainland, to be processed if Christmas Island does fill up. But the Prime Minister said he's only doing what the former Prime Minister John Howard did. Let's have a look at some of the debate.
The government has for a long period of time indicated that if further capacity is needed at various other locations within the country, then of course we would recourse to that. As I would draw the honourable member's attention to my earlier answer, when on previous occasions during the time of the Pacific Solution, the government at that stage brought various asylum seekers to processing centres within Australia.
Tony Abbott, though, reminded Kevin Rudd of his promise to take a hardline approach on this issue before the last election.
Prime Minister, with 24 boats and over 1,200 unauthorised arrivals in just the past 10 weeks, isn't his hollow promise of 2007 just the latest example of a government which is all talk and no action?
We continue to maintain a policy which includes offshore processing, which includes mandatory detention, which includes stringent health, identity and security checks, which protects our national security, and one in which we also act consistently with this country's international obligations.
Scott Morrison and Jason Clare are with me this morning on our panel of politicians. Jason Clare, the boats just keep on coming. They're showing no sign of abating, are they? What's the government doing about it, trying to stop them?
Well, it's a tough issue. It's been a tough issue for governments for the last 30 years. Scott and I actually agree on about 95% of the policy here. Scott won't tell you this, but we agree on 95% of it. We agree on mandatory detention. We agree on the resources that you need to give the Navy to do the interdiction and the surveillance on the high seas. We agree that you need to work with your neighbours. We need to work with Indonesia to stop people smuggling in those transit countries, and we saw the good work that happens when you work with Indonesia last week. What we don't agree on are the two things that didn't work. I don't agree with Scott on temporary protection visas. When they were introduced, the number of boats increased, didn't decrease. And I don't agree with Scott on the introduction or the reintroduction of the Pacific Solution, which cost $1 billion, 1,700 people put on an island out somewhere in the South Pacific that cost $500,000 per person, and 60% of the people there ended up coming to Australia in the end.
But it's not ideal, is it, for asylum seekers to be taken to Darwin to be processed, which is what inevitably seems like is going to happen. I think there's only 100 or so spare beds.
There's still capacity there at the moment, but we've said for the last 6 months that if necessary then we will be able to put asylum seekers at Darwin. That's exactly the same thing as happened under the Howard government. So there is no difference here between what we are doing, or what we will do if necessary, and what the Howard government did when necessary under the Pacific Solution.
Scott Morrison, what is wrong with taking asylum seekers to Darwin to be processed?
Well, let me just correct a couple of things. Firstly, what the Prime Minister said, and also what Jason said. What was done when we were in government in bringing people to the mainland for temporary purposes is completely different to what this government is proposing. We introduced special provisions into the Migration Act that enabled people to be transferred for a temporary purpose to them for health or medivac purposes or things of that nature. There are only a few people who are the subject of those types of transitions, and it was only for a temporary purpose. This is a permanent transfer. This is a process of saying Christmas Island is full, our policies have failed, and we're now going to bring people to the mainland before their asylum claims have been assessed. Now, there are two problems with that, to come to your question. The first one is that it sends a message to people smugglers that you can now get your clients all the way to the mainland. It ups the sugar, as President Udiono would talk about in terms of pull factors. It ups the sugar factor. Secondly, it opens up a very real murky legal territory on this issue. Now, the situation, as the UNHCR said last week, in both Sri Lanka and in Afghanistan is changing. If people's claims are rejected when they're on the mainland, that will be tested in the courts. Now, Senator Evans says, no, that can't happen. Well, it takes one judge in one court to hear this issue and test whether someone's status will be affected if they transfer to the mainland. Now, when we were in government, we put in a provision to enable a transitional transfer. This government has not done this to quarantine our laws in terms of any movements they might make of people. Now, I think that's reckless. I think it is the last straw in terms of dismantling the regime they inherited, and that's why we have 10 boats arriving per month, the highest on record.
Jason Clare, what do you make of that argument that asylum seekers could be given better access to the court system? And as Scott raises there that, one judge could make a decision on this?
Well, it's just simply not right. And Scott knows it's not right. The legal advice that the government's got, the legal advice that you've been given when you've spoken to Amnesty International, refugee organisations, or when you've sought the right advice, the advice is that the legal status of the individuals doesn't change, whether they're on Christmas Island or whether they're on Darwin. And what Scott is saying is, Scott is saying is that over my dead body, no one would ever come from Christmas Island to Darwin. We'd put them on some island out the back of Iceland. Now, what the Pacific solution showed us is that it costs more. So Scott is saying the taxpayers can pay more because we won't put them on Darwin if we have to. We'll send them out to Nauru. Well, the evidence from the Pacific solution was it cost $1 billion, $500,000 per person, and 60% ended up coming to Australia. So what Scott is advocating is that it costs more for the taxpayer. That is not the right or responsible approach.
He's raised the issue of cost.
Do talk about the cost, and also I want to ask you about that issue of giving the message to asylum seekers that they can get all the way to the mainland. Do you think they really get that message when they're taking off on boats as to where they're going and what the legal
Absolutely. I've been to Christmas Island. I've seen the people sitting in the centres on Skype talking to their families back in Sri Lanka or back in Pakistan or back wherever they are. The flow of information about what's happening in terms of the government's policies and the changes gets through. And this is what people smugglers use to ply their trade. They're asking people to pay $20,000 per person to get on a boat. Now, they're going to want to know that they're going to get what they're paying for. And this helps the people smugglers make that claim stick. But on the issue of costs, already this year, because of the unprecedented flow of arrivals to this country, what we have seen is the government asked for an extra $132 million on their original budget estimate just to catch up with the 3,100 that have already arrived, and then tracking that forward to the end of the year, it'll cost another $250 million this year alone. So over the forward estimates, and this year alone, that will be an extra $1 billion in cost because of their failed policies. Jason wants to talk about cost, putting people with a massive flow of arrivals. There were only 6 people on Christmas Island last year. 6 people. 6 people. There are now over 1,900 on that island because of this government's policies, and it's costing $81,000 per person who turns up.
$81,000 compares with $500,000 per person for the Pacific solution.
You're what a waste of money.
That's out there.
What a waste of money.
You guys aren't looking at any other option other than bring people to the mainland.
No one can
That's
hear
your
us
plan.
and we're all talking at once. Just on the politics of this, Jason, as long as the boats keep coming, these complex arguments, I'm not sure that they flow through to voters at the level that we've just been discussing about the legal arguments. But as long as these boats keep coming, it's fair for the coalition to keep bringing this up as an issue, and it's getting through to the voters.
Well, they'll continue to play politics on this, I'm sure. But the people I talk to understand that a civil war has just ended in Sri Lanka. Next month is the 35th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. The end of a war in Vietnam, that's when people got on boats and came to Australia. The same thing is happening here. Now, Scott debated this issue at Sydney University a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Mary Crock, who is an expert in international law, and she said to Scott that the only pull factor at play here is the Liberal Party rhetoric, that it was the scare campaign by the Liberal Party that was encouraging people smugglers in Indonesia. So there you go.
We have run out of time, Scott Morrison. I'm sure you'll be taking up this argument in question time this afternoon. We actually have run out of time. We've got to get to the news. Sorry, Scott.
Next time.
Next time we'll be together again.
Yes, I hope so.
So we'll look forward to question time today. We should all be counting the number of references to Peter Costello. That should be fun to watch. Do join David Spears as well this afternoon for PM Agenda. He'll be having a full wrap of the goings-on of QT today. I'll be back with you tomorrow morning. Thanks for your company.